Hello, my name is Joe Cartwright and welcome to my studio. This is my first video for 2026 and today I'm going to be tackling a subject which at first seems obvious but isn't necessarily so. So the subject of today's painting is going to be how you should hold your brush when you're creating a watercolor painting. If you hold your brush only in one way, you will severely limit the types of edges and shapes you can create in your painting. So in today's video, I want you to concentrate on how I'm holding my brush when I'm creating the various edges and shapes in this simple seascape. So let's get started. As usual with a painting like this, I begin by wetting the back of my paper. While the paper is absorbing the water, we'll mix some colours. The biggest shape is our sky in this case, so we'll use plenty of water. And I'm just going to mix some cobalt blue. Because primarily this painting is for me to show you how I hold the brush, I don't want to make it too complex. That's good. That'll do for the sky. And then for the beach, I'll just use some raw umber. And that'll do for that. All right, we'll start with the sky. I'm going to create a big cloud here, small one there, and maybe a medium cloud here. And the sky will be darker in tone here than the distant sky, which is way back in the horizon. I'll start with plenty of paint in my brush. And here I'm holding it in such a way that the paint flows out of my brush easily. Now I'm going to start thinking about my clouds. So now I'm changing the way I'm holding the brush so that I can bring the brush down almost parallel to the paper. And it's these few little hairs that stick out that are allowing me to create these cloud effects. And at this point, I'm barely touching the paper and the point of the brush is not touching the paper at all. And because it's a warm day, even though I've wet the back of the paper, I'm also going to keep my spray bottle handy just to keep the moisture content up to the paper. Now I'm going to dip my brush in the water. That'll just dilute it. Dilute it some more. And this is the horizon here. Now when painting the horizon, if you try and paint the horizon with the tip of your brush, you'll find it quite difficult to keep quite straight. The best way to do it is to hold the brush like this and then just very lightly press, very lightly, and then you can just drag the brush along and see how easy it is to keep that line on the paper. So here we're changing how we hold the brush and also how much pressure we apply on the paper to create the mark we want. I'm going to clean my brush, then come back and use that clean water to paint these cloud shapes. And some darker paint will give us some shapes within the clouds. I'm going to bring this cloud down a little bit. Now, because of the heat and the fact I'm speeding things up, you can see there's still some areas that are cockled. That's because I just didn't wait long enough for the water to be absorbed on the back of the painting. And we'll paint this cloud through the hill. I'm just going to wet a section of the beach here. There. The areas I wet will create a soft edge connection between the waves and the sand. So the tone of the sand will be lighter in the distance. It'll also be a bit cooler. That's why I painted some of the sky down to the horizon line. That sky colour is mixing with the sand colour, and it's automatically making it a bit cooler and lighter because it had quite a lot of water in it. But as we come forward, we want the sand colour to be stronger in tone. I'm also adding a little bit of burnt sienna, because the other thing that happens when objects come closer to the viewer is they're also a bit warmer. So burnt sienna is warmer than raw umber, hence that's why I've used it. Just very quickly, I'll pick up some of this paint here, add some raw umber and burnt sienna. Add a little bit of French ultramarine just to dull it a bit. I'm just using some splatter to add some shapes and make a fairly empty space look a bit more interesting. I've left a few white areas. Some of those will become rocks later, or the highlights on rocks. So now another way we use the brush is, instead of trying to dab all these marks, we literally just lightly tap it to our finger and you can create these marks. If you have a problem with your finger, if you've got arthritis or something like that, you can also just do that. Whatever is convenient. All right, so there's our sky, there's the beach. Now we'll work on the water. And you can see here where I wet it before, I've got a lovely soft shape, and I've got a soft shape here. Just get rid of most of this cobalt blue. Not because I can't use it, but just there's too much of it. We only have a very small sliver of ocean here. Pick up some French ultramarine. add a little bit of burnt sienna to it. Before I do anything else, because this area is still quite wet at the horizon, I need to dry that. Otherwise, when I try and paint the distant horizon, the paint will just flow up into the sky, and it probably will end up creating a cauliflower up here. So let me just go and dry that with a hairdryer. Actually, before we do the water, let's work on these rocks and these trees. I'm going to mix a dull green colour, primarily with raw umber and some French ultramarine. And I'm going to brighten it with some aureolin. Windsor lemon would be the same. Any lemon or lemon leaning green will do. That's good. Just like when I did the clouds, instead of holding the brush and trying to paint this way, if I do that, I'll end up with sharp edges instead of more interesting edges like this here. So again, just like doing the clouds, I hold the brush without too much paint in it, so the paint won't drip out if I do that. Hold it almost parallel to the paper and barely touching the paper. All I'm interested in here is to create the impression of foliage. Depending on the angle of your board, you may have to hold the brush a little bit differently to me, but the main thing is to create this sort of mark. You want your brush so that the point is not touching the paper and the brush is almost parallel to the paper, barely touching the paper. That'll do. Then I'll pick up some of this brown and green, mix them together. It's a bit too brown. Now for the rocks, let's grab some French ultramarine, lots of burnt sienna, and we'll create a dark colour that just lightly leans to the brown. And now, can you see how I'm dragging the brush to create more of a sharp edge? And I'll speed my brush strokes when I want to create this broken edge. So the tip of the brush gives you quite a defined shape. And at the water's edge, I'm going to leave a broken edge there, because that will read like foam on the water later. and I'll vary the colour. Again, this is not about the painting as much as about how I hold the brush. I'm going to add a little bit of interest by just varying the tone of some of this paint. I'll put some rocks down here. And for the sake of this exercise, that's good enough. I want to create a slightly darker tone of this green. I'll go in, again, not too much paint on my brush. The reason I did that is the tone of the foliage has to be a little bit similar, at least, to the tone of the hillside, which would have foliage on it. Okay. Now we can paint the ocean. And I can use the same technique I used when painting the bottom of the sky to paint the top of the ocean. This gives me a lot of control. Then when I get into the detail, I can use the tip of my brush. Now I'm going to pick up some water, paint into that, and I'm going to clean the brush. Again, this time I'm holding the brush for this sort of shape around about at the end of the ferrule, and quick brush strokes like that to create what we call a broken edge. I'm going to go back and darken this mixture here. Just French ultramarine and burnt sienna. And we can use that to add some ripples. And you can see how that broken edge there, which is just a quick movement of the hand, creates little waves for us. Now we've got these rocks here. Because they're smaller shape, I'm using the tip of the brush for some of it. This is a bit too dark, so I'll just lift that. So I'm lifting it by basically cleaning my brush, taking most of the water out of it, and then letting that thirsty brush lift the paint. You need to dry that. Up until now, we've been painting just with a size 12 brush. Size 12 brush, or my size 12 brush, has hairs on it that are just over 2.5 centimetres or an inch in the imperial scale. It's important to be aware of that dimension because not every size 12 brush will have hairs the same size. The important thing is how much hair is in the brush, because that determines how much paint the brush can hold. There's no standard amongst brush manufacturers that say one manufacturer's size 12 brush is the same size as another, so keep that in mind. But we're now painting small shapes, so especially for the figures, I'm just going to pick a size 6 brush for this, because I would find it very difficult to paint the finest little shapes with the size 12 brush. I'm just going to mix some Scarlet Lake and raw umber as a flesh tone. Really more raw umber than Scarlet Lake, but it doesn't matter. This is just an exercise with painting. And you can see now I'm holding the brush on the ferrule, so I'm very close to the paper surface, and because this is dry, I'm also resting this part of my hand on the paper. This gives me a lot of control with these smaller shapes. I'm not trying to be too realistic here. Then I'll go back to my size 12 brush. I'm currently painting on a quarter sheet, and if you're painting on an 1/8 sheet, which is half of a quarter sheet, you might find yourself being more comfortable with a smaller brush like a size 8 brush for some of these in-between shapes, while still using a size 12 brush for the big shapes in the sky and the water. Quite often on the sand you'll have some seaweed, and we can create that with some quick brush strokes just like that, barely touching the paper. Just to add some shapes there. And then where these highlights are, I can paint under that, leave a bit of a highlight, and that becomes a rock. Some of these too. and the figures, the hill and some of these rocks will have a little shadow. Let's make some room in my palette for that. We don't need any more of this green. So for my shadow, I'm going to use some French ultramarine and a little bit of permanent rose. Just a tiny amount of burnt sienna. Now, shadows are always away from the light, so in this case, I'm going to assume the light is coming this way. So we'll just paint in a shadow shape for the figures. These rocks will have a little shadow shape. And there'll be a hint of a shadow here, not so much. Now I'm going to put some birds in the sky, so I'm going to go back to a small brush. And again, I'm grabbing the brush on the ferrule. And I usually sign with a small brush. I've purposefully kept this painting simple so that you can concentrate more on how I hold the brush rather than the subject that I'm painting. Hopefully you've noticed how I vary where I hold the brush along the handle, sometimes coming up very close to the hairs themselves when painting finer details. Also, hopefully you've noticed how I change the angle of the brush when I'm wanting to create either sharp edges or some of these lovely broken edges in the water, or for the edges of the foliage or the edges of the cloud. I vary the consistency or vary the amount of paint in my brush so that when I'm painting big flattish shapes up here, I've got a lot of paint in my brush. When I'm trying to create these cloud shapes or the edges of the foliage, maybe half the amount of paint. And then as I'm getting into smaller details, I'm using a smaller brush and I'm getting very close to the hairs of the brush and even rest my hand on the paper to give me even more control. I hope you found this helpful. If you have, please give the video a like, and if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, please do so. It helps me out a lot. And if you're able, please consider supporting me on Patreon. I look forward to seeing you for the next one.